The wrestling world lost another one this week. Not a genius, but the genius. The news was broken by his good friend Hacksaw Jim Duggan on Thursday. With a very, very heavy heart, I have been asked to let everyone know about the passing of our friend and colleague, Lanny Poffo, the genius. Very sad to hear of another name from my childhood gone. And at a relatively young age, 68 is not that old. And he wasn't known to be dealing with any kind of serious illness, unless he was keeping that to himself. He had been living in Ecuador for the last few years. He got an oceanside condo down there, although in the Observer it said that he moved away from the water and up one of the mountains there last March, I guess because his allergies started bothering him and he was having breathing problems. But he was staying with a friend in New York this past week. He had just been in New Jersey for a virtual autograph signing. The cause of death is not yet known, but he was out and about, and he seemed to be fine, so whatever it was very sudden. Booker T on his Hall of Fame podcast said that he was just with Lanny a few weeks ago filming stuff in Connecticut for the next season of the WWE Hidden Treasure show, and he seemed perfectly fine. Lanny was a member of the Poffo wrestling family, as I'm sure most, if not all of you are aware. The son of Angelo Poffo, more well known as the brother of the Macho Man, Randy Savage. Of course, the Poffo family went to war with the Memphis territory back in the 70s with their renegade promotion, ICW. And when that war ended, Lanny, he had a brief stint working for Bill Watts in Mid-South, but ultimately landed in the WWF. And in 85, George Scott was the booker. He wanted to sign Randy Savage, and Savage insisted that they sign his brother Lanny also. So they brought them both into the company at the same time. When he started working there, he was a babyface. He was calling himself Leaping Lanny Poffo, and he would toss frisbees out to the crowd. And he may have been the first U.S. wrestler to use a moonsault, which he has said before he learned from watching a tape of the original Tiger Mask from Japan. I remember Leaping Lanny from squash matches, mostly, and matches from the old primetime wrestling show. But his big run came as the genius, managing Mr. Perfect as a heel. He wore the cap and gown. He had a scroll with him at all times with poems that he would recite. All original poems, by the way, that he himself would write. He was very talented. But it was such an obnoxious gimmick. It got him a ton of heat. He gave Howard Finkel a lot of credit for helping him craft the gimmick, and Hulk Hogan as well. Hogan even put him over in a match on Saturday night's main event. Now, it was by countout, and it was with help from Mr. Perfect, but in the record books, it will forever say that the genius has a win over Hulk Hogan. And there aren't too many people, especially from that period of time, who can say they have a singles win over Hulk Hogan. But he had only just started working with Perfect the month before that, and then he would tag with Perfect in matches against Hogan and Brutus Beefcake and do handicap matches with Perfect against Hogan that always did big business. Hogan always did big business back then. So if you were working on top with him, you knew you were making good money that night. There were guys, WWF back then for a period of time in the mid to late 80s would have as many as 3 or 4 live event crews in different parts of the country. You had the A team, the B team, and then the C team. Sometimes they'd have the D team. You always wanted to be on whatever team Hogan was on. You always wanted to be on the A team, like Mr. T. So they did big business together. But he always had nice things to say about Hogan, because he recognized that without Hogan, he never would have gotten the push that he did. And in fact, when his brother did that rap album many years later with, To Be a Man, Hulk, right? He was calling out Hulk Hogan and challenging him. Lanny told Wrestling Inc. that Randy wanted him to write the lyrics for it, and Lanny wouldn't do it. It's the one time he said no to something that his brother asked him to do. He said, I can't write, a negative song about somebody who is such a positive influence in my life and on my career. I won't do it. He said in his 21 years of wrestling, the best time of his career were those few, and it really was only a few months, we're talking 4 or 5 months maybe, that he spent working with Hogan. And after his run with Perfect came to an end, Bobby Heenan ended up managing Mr. Perfect. Lanny managed the Beverly Brothers for a while. You guys know my feelings on the 1992 Royal Rumble, right? Greatest Rumble of all time. But there was another match that night with the Beverleys and the Genius in their corner against the Bushwhackers, who had Jameson in theirs. And if you don't know who Jameson is, the less said about him, the better. That was fucking terrible. And it had nothing to do with Lanny. But later that year, he was gone from the company. And then there's the great story, of course, of his WCW run. Now, you may be thinking, what WCW run? I don't remember Lanny being in WCW. There's a reason for that. It's his great WCW run because it's the run where he got paid for 4 years to sit home and do nothing. I want that job. How do I get that job? But it's true. When Savage was negotiating his next deal with Eric Bischoff, this may have been a year or so into his first run there. He went to Eric and he said, I want you to hire my brother. He was looking out for his brother. He wanted Eric to hire Lanny. Family was very important to Randy Savage, which is why he had heat with Vince McMahon for not including his father in that Legends Battle Royal they did back in 1987. Savage went to Vince. He asked that his father be included. And this was, I don't even know if this was televised anywhere, maybe locally. But it was at like the Meadowlands or something. They were doing some sort of Legends Battle Royal. And he went to Vince and said, I want my father in the Battle Royal. And Vince said no. And he always, obviously Randy worked for Vince for many more years after that. But Lanny always said that Randy loved Vince up to that point, but he hated him for that ever since. So Savage told Bischoff that he had purchased the rights to the Gorgeous George name. And he had this idea that, Lanny would come in to reprise the role. Gorgeous George was the biggest star in wrestling for a time back in the 50s. When Savage first pitched the idea of bringing Lanny in, Bischoff said no. He just couldn't justify the expense. So Randy, and this is according to Eric, who's talked about this on his 83 Weeks podcast, since he was in the midst of negotiating Savage's next deal, Savage offered to take less money to help bring his brother in. He was willing to take a pay cut. That had to be at least $100,000 so that Eric would hire Lanny. So he did. And for 4 years, Lanny Poffo sat at home by his phone, waiting for the call. Randy told him, bleach your hair blonde. He would call him all the time, making sure he was still in shape and he was working out, and nothing ever came of it. He got paid 6 figures to sit at home and train. Basically, that's it. And Bischoff said, because of the Slim Jim deal, Randy came into WCW with that Slim Jim deal. Randy cost him nothing. Slim Jim covered his entire salary, so he got a big name from WWE for $0 out of pocket. And because of that, Lanny ended up costing him nothing. So however financially it worked out, Eric, said okay because it was going to cost him nothing, but they never came up with anything for him to do. The Gorgeous George gimmick eventually went to Savage's girlfriend many years later, but I always wondered, why Gorgeous George? Why would Randy Savage buy the rights to that name? And in reading up on Lanny a little bit more, I came across a Slam Wrestling story from last year where he explains everything, and I did not know this before. But in 1952, his father was the designated driver for the original Gorgeous George, and Randy was about to be born. And his father told George, look, I'm thinking of retiring from the wrestling business. And George told him, you're nuts. If you do that, you're crazy. You've got charisma. You could be a success. You just need to give it time. And so Angelo did. And obviously he found great success. And years later, when George fell on hard times, he was broke and, he's a raging alcoholic. And he passed away. Angelo found out that they couldn't bury him. He was not going to get a proper burial because he was broke. He had no money. So Angelo paid for his funeral. And Lanny said that his father told him, I paid for his funeral because if it wasn't for Gorgeous George, I would have quit the wrestling business. So that would explain Savage's affinity for the Gorgeous George name. I never knew that. But it goes back to my point about how important family was to Randy Savage. Gorgeous George was very important to his father, and therefore he was important to Randy. But Lanny had always maintained that Randy did not want to go, into the WWE Hall of Fame unless they put him in with his father and his brother as a family, like they did with the Von Erichs. In 2015, Randy finally went in, but it was by himself. And they had Hulk Hogan do the induction, so I'm sure he would have been doubly pissed at that. Even though Hogan always claims that that fateful meeting where they bumped into each other at the same doctor, at the doctor's office, and all was forgiven, and that's the story Hogan tells. But the problem is I'd love to believe that that's true and that the two of them, had a reconciliation before Savage passed away, but it's fucking Hogan. As I've said before, if he's breathing, you have to assume he's not telling the truth. But Lanny, he accepted on his brother's behalf, and he got to talk about his brother on stage at the Hall of Fame. He said on his podcast once, because Lanny had his own show called The Genius Cast. He only did about 20 episodes. He said he didn't see Randy's induction as a Hall of Fame induction so much as he saw it as a eulogy for his brother, to let people know the kind of person that he was beyond the ring. That, and he felt that the fans were deprived of his brother giving a speech of his own one day. So that's why he agreed to allow his brother to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, even against Randy's own wishes. Because Randy was, according to Lanny, Randy was insistent that if this is going to happen, it's got to be all three of us going in. And that's not what ended up happening. Now look, WWE, when I say that, that's why Lanny agreed to allow Randy to be inducted, WWE could technically do whatever the fuck it wants. They could put Owen Hart in the Hall of Fame this year if they wanted to, right? But it's a bad look when you have family members being so publicly, adamantly against it. It's bad PR for them, so they won't do it. I'll never forgive Vince McMahon for waiting until Savage was dead to induct him into the Hall of Fame for the very reason that Lanny said, depriving the fans of what could have been probably one of the best speeches ever given at a Hall of Fame ceremony. But yeah, we talk a lot. You hear me talking here a lot about Randy Savage, even though Lanny is the one who passed away, right? We talk a lot about Savage when we talk about Lanny because the two are so closely linked. In his book, and how cool is it that his autobiography was done in comic book form? I think it's only like 30 pages long, but I mean, how many autobiographies are done with comic book illustrations? But the way he ended his own book was not talking about himself. It was with some words from the speech that he gave inducting his brother into the Hall of Fame. And John Crowther, he was one of the men who collaborated with Lanny to write the book. He spoke to The Ringer, and he told The Ringer when they used to do convention appearances together, Lanny, he never took any money for autographs or books or action figures for his own gain. He would accept donations to children's charities on behalf of his brother and not himself. And I think that says a lot about Lanny Poffo, the man.